Okay, well, tonight we're going to take Daniel and the lion's den. And on the one hand, it's a very well-known story to you, and yet at the same time, looking at it carefully may reveal some nuances that hopefully will be constructive. But we'll also share with you some, I think, will be surprises. What does the lion's den have to do with Christmas? What does the lion's den have to do with Christmas? And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get there. We're in chapter 6 of the book of Daniel. And first thing I might mention, there's some ambiguity about Darius the Mede. He comes up several times. And Darius may be an honorable title. It may mean simply the holder of the scepter. But it is used of 5 later Persian rulers. And there are at least 4 conjectures as to who Darius is, as referred to in chapter 5 in part and also in this chapter. Some scholars feel that it's actually an allusion to Cyrus, the top guy himself. Donald Weissman of the British Museum published that view. Others feel it's the son of Cyrus, Cambyses, the son of Cyrus. And there are reputable authors that hold that view. But it is very clear also that Darius is an appointed guy. So that causes me to dismiss those first 2, personally at least, because in Daniel 9, we'll discover when we get there, he's clearly appointed. In fact, one of the likely people that he would be appointed with would be Ugbaru. And by the way, that's similar to Gubaru. It's just different ways of spelling the same name. He was the governor of Gutium. He was the general of the Persians that conquered Babylon for Cyrus. And so there are several competent scholars that make that case. And Ugbaru, you may recall, on October 12th of 539, he entered Babylon the night of Belshazzar's feast. We went through that in detail time before last, as you recall, the famous handwriting on the wall and all of that. But you see, it was just about 2 weeks after that Cyrus makes his grand entrance. And the history seems to indicate that Cyrus then appointed Ugbaru to rule Babylon, not the Persian Empire. Cyrus ruled the whole Persian Empire, but he did such a magnificent job conquering this presumably impregnable city that he was appointed, and I personally suspect he's the one that Darius is referring to. But in any case, on November 6th, only a very short time later, he died. He was, after all, we don't know that he was 62 when he took over, because the last verse of chapter 5 told us that. And so the Darius that closes chapter 5 may be the title that was given to Ugbaru, the general that accomplished it. And by the way, some of your books will say Ugbaru, some say Gabaru. They're just that's an alternate spelling in the Aramaic. Gobrias is the Greek equivalent of all of that. And that's listed in a number of records. We have pretty good visibility of that. So Darius is whoever you want it to be. We'll move on. Okay. Daniel in the lion's den. This is one of those episodes in the Old Testament that gets named in the famous Hall of Faith, Hebrews 11. When you get down to verse 33 of Hebrews 11, it says, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, and stopped the mouths of lions. So if you want a subtitle for this, we can just say Lockjaw in the Lion's Den or something like that and move on. Let's just jump into Daniel 6, verse 1. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes, which should be over the whole kingdom. And over these 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was the first, that the princes might give accounts unto them, that the king should have no damage. And now Daniel, you realize, is about 83 years old here. But he also has about 66 years in public office under Babylon. So he's in a position of honor here. He was an exceptional administrator, obviously, because of nothing else, because of his extensive experience under Nebuchadnezzar, very intimate experience with Nebuchadnezzar for virtually 40 years. So it's interesting, Darius sets up 120 princes. Those are not necessarily 120 areas that each had. They could just been officers in some kind of bureaucratic sense. There's a lot of discussions about that. We can spare ourselves here. But in any case, the 220 were over the whole kingdom, and they each reported, well, collectively they reported to 3 presidents, which Daniel was the first, not just one of the 3, but the first. This, stand back and be impressed with this young man. He was kidnapped, in effect, as a teenager. brought into slavery to Babylon, and through the exploits that we read in chapter 2 and following, he rises to become the prime minister of this world empire under Nebuchadnezzar. In fact, he becomes very intimate with Nebuchadnezzar. I believe when Nebuchadnezzar went through his 7 years of convalescence, the Talmud tells us that it was Daniel that took care of him. So he's a remarkable human being. But now Babylon is taken over by their enemies, the Persians. And he emerges to be the top guy among he's right under the top guy. At least in the Babylonian part of it, because Darius is not in charge of the whole Persian Empire, the Babylonian portion of it. And so we have these three presidents, of whom Daniel was the first. And okay, so then this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and princes because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king thought to set him over the whole realm. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? What do you think goes along with that? Envy. How do you think that sat with the regulars? I mean, this old Jewish man's going to be put in charge. You think they're excited about that? It gets more complicated, but we'll take that when it comes later. Then the presidents and princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom. But they could find none occasion or fault, for as much as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault in him. Boy, wouldn't you and I wish that our report card was like that? They could find no occasion or fault in him. You know, in an election year, you watch the rhetoric, not just for the top guys, but everybody gets involved in politics. Boy, the media just digs out all the dirt. And you get the impression that, there's just nobody with clean hands in today's world. It's interesting that his rivals, 120 of them, could find no occasion or fault. For he was faithful. Neither was there any error or fault found in him. Then said these men, we shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. Not that he breaks the law, but because you can count on him keeping the law. It's interesting, he often says that if you're being tried as a Christian, there's not enough evidence to convict you. I remember what Peter Drucker said when somebody asked him, he's a very prolific author in management literature, somebody asked him if he was a Christian. He says, that's for you to tell me. What a perceptive answer. What a perceptive answer. Well, in any case, these guys are obviously going to gang up on Daniel. They know the only chance they have is to find an occasion of his faithfulness in practice. What a guy this is. So then these presidents and princes assembled together to the king and said thus unto him, King Darius, live forever. By the way, this is an interesting phrase because this whole assumed divinity of kings, if you study world history, you're very familiar with this concept that's very early of the divinity of kings. How many have heard that term, have studied that? I got a history up here that knows all about divinity. The divine right of the kings, right? You know where that starts? Anybody know where that starts? Genesis 6. I'll leave you with that to do your homework, but we'll move on. In any case, King Darius lived forever, and all the presidents of the kingdom, the governors, the princes, and the counselors, and the captains have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whosoever shall ask a petition of any god or man for 30 days, save of thee, O king, he shall be cast in the den of lions. Boy, what an ego trip they got the king on. You're going to force people under penalty of death to ask no God for anything except to you. All the presidents of the kingdom. Now that's a lie, of course, because they certainly didn't ask Daniel to be part of this, did they? But see, they just represent that all of us presidents agree, king. All the governors, princes, counselors, captains have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree. Now, one of the things you'll learn here very quickly, and you may remember from the book of Esther, if you study the book of Esther, the Persian administration was very different than the Babylonian. Nebuchadnezzar was above the law. Whom he would, he could kill. And whom he chose not to, he didn't have to. He was above the law. He was an absolute despot, maybe the most absolute despot that ever lived. The Persians had a different system. The king was not above the law. Once he signed a law, he was stuck with it. He couldn't change it. Sounds bizarre to us, but that's the way it was. And that was the dilemma in the book of Esther. When he realizes he made a huge mistake under the counsel of Haman, all he could do, all the Jews were going to kill, all he could do is issue an edict that the Jews were entitled to fight back. And if you know the story of Esther, that's a key aspect of the book of Esther. Well, it's also a very key aspect here because Darius is going to regret very deeply that these guys talked him into this ego trip. That whosoever shall ask a petition of any god or man for 30 days, said of thee, O king, he shall be cast in the den of lions. They obviously, this is called entrapment. They're trying to nail him. So now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing that it not be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which altereth not. In other words, once he signs this, even the king can't change it. Wherefore, King Darius signed the writing and the decree. Big mistake. Big mistake. Now, when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, what did he do? Boy, how interesting. He knew the writing was signed. What's the first thing he did? Nothing out of the unusual. He went into his house, and his windows being open in his bedchamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he did aforetime. Boy, this little verse is packed with a lot of insight here. Jerusalem was a couple of 100 miles to the west in rubble. Why have the windows towards Jerusalem? Because that was what he was called to do. That's what the scripture calls him to do in 2 Chronicles 6 and a number of places, 1 Kings 8 and so on. David's Psalms is full of that. So that was he had his windows open towards Jerusalem, and he kneeled upon his knees. Now, I think we are all sophisticated enough to realize you can pray any way you like. You can pray while you're driving a car. You can pray, a lot of us do. A lot of us need to very quickly on some occasions. But it's interesting that in the scripture, Old and New Testament, you can find people on their knees. The Lord was on his knees in Luke 22 and so forth. It's interesting that in chapter 3, the Jewish young men were honored for not being on their knees. Remember? Okay. But Stephen was on his knees in Acts 7, Peter in Acts 9, and you can make a case that it certainly is not a mistake to be on your knees. In fact, you'll also find, if you really study worship, that the Levites were prostrate before the Holy of Holies and so on. So, obviously, your adoration and worship of God is in the spirit, not physical, but I think it's helpful for us to have it all consistent. In any case, he kneeled upon his knees. How often? 3 times a day. Most of us feel pretty good if we spend a half an hour each day, starting the day off, or finishing the day, or better yet, both. Daniel did it 3 times a day, and he prayed. Gave thanks before his God as he did aforetime. In other words, this was his routine. He didn't do it because it was signed. He just didn't let the fact that this law was signed interrupt his commitment. Boy, there's a lot of lessons in this. Well, then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication for his God. And by the way, the language implies it was a tumult. It wasn't that they assembled. There was like a riot. They really made a thing of it. Then they came near and spake before the king concerning the king's decree. He said to the king, Hast thou not signed a decree that every man that shall ask a petition of any god or man within 30 days, save of thee, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? In other words, they want to make sure he signed it before they bring this up. The king answered and said, The thing is true, according to the law of Medes and Persians, which altereth not. Then answered they and said before the king, That Daniel, which is of the children of the captivity of Judah, and that's intended to be a slur here, regardeth not thee, O king, nor the decree that thou hast signed, but maketh his petition 3 times a day. Then the king, when he heard these words, was sore displeased with himself. Notice who he's displeased with. He's not displeased at Daniel. He's displeased with himself because at this point he recognizes that he's been set up, that this has been a trap that these envious rivals have done this, used him to set this up. So he sore displeased with himself and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. And he labored till going down to the sun to deliver him. He went, I assume what he did, he went to his attorneys, tried to find a loophole, tried to find some way. And apparently there were legal restrictions that even the king could not undo this document that they got him to sign. It's interesting to see where the king's heart is. I see a parallel between this king and Nebuchadnezzar. Both of them are on Daniel's side. And then these men assembled unto the king and said unto the king, Know, O king, that the law of the Medes and the Persians is that no decree or statute which the king established may be changed. And obviously, if he could have been, he would have found a way, because he apparently worked all day with his advisors to find a way. And the king commanded, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. Boy, boy, boy. Now the king spake and said unto Daniel, notice where Daniel's getting his encouragement from. The king spake and said unto Daniel, Thy God whom thou servest continually, he will deliver thee. Now some commentators say that's just probably wishful thinking. Some commentators assume that he probably knew what happened back in Babylon in chapter 3 with the fiery furnace, although that didn't involve Daniel, interestingly enough. But anyway, let's not get to that here. I personally take that I suspect that the king was certainly apprehensive about it, but I think the king had at least some confidence that the God that Daniel worshiped was effectual, and you'll see that manifest itself in a little bit here. Cast him in the den of lions. Now, those you are prophecy buffs, what I'll suggest Daniel's challenge is not to receive the mark of the beast, right? You gonna let me get away with that? Okay. Oh, yeah. Pretty bad, isn't it? Yeah. Somebody gave me a T-shirt recently that had the word of God is like a lion. You turn it loose, it'll defend itself. And it attributed that to me, and I was very flattered with the T-shirt. I said, I never said that, but it sure sounds like me. But I did find it on one of my old tapes. I guess I did say that once. Anyway, verse 17. And a stone was brought and laid upon the mouth of the den. Notice this. They sealed this thing. A stone was brought and laid upon the mouth of the den. And the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords. And that was his double sealed. Why? So the king couldn't let him out. Interesting situation here. Sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, and that the purpose might not be changed concerning Daniel. And the king went to his palace and passed the night fasting. Neither were instruments of music brought before him, and his sleep went from him. I personally suspect that Daniel had a better night of it than he did. It wouldn't surprise me if Daniel had a good nap. But the king didn't. He was up all night. Tells you where his heart is. The king arose very early in the morning and went in haste unto the den of lions. And when he came to the den, he cried with a lamentable voice unto Daniel. And the king spake and said to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God. Now that's quite a title. Boy, would I love someone who's calling me, Chuck, a servant of the living God. I'd love to have that identity, man. O Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God whom thou servest continually able to deliver thee from the lions? Obviously he has a doubt in his mind, and he has an expectation, but he certainly has a doubt in his mind. Then Daniel said unto the king, O king, live forever. My God hath sent his angel, and hath shut the lions' mouths, that they have not hurt me. Forasmuch as before him innocency was found in me, and also before thee, O king, have I done no hurt. Boy, this guy Daniel. Then was the king exceeding glad for him, and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no manner of hurt was found upon him. Because, why? He believed in his God. And by the way, the word here is a little weak. He did more than believe in his God. He relied on that belief. That's called faith. Faith is not just believing. James tells us that the devils also believe and tremble. Believing is not enough. Relying on. You may believe that chair holds your weight, But until you're sitting on it, you're not trusting it. You follow what I'm saying? Clumsy example, but you get the idea. Well, we're not through. There's a principle called lex talionis that the king applies here. There is a and by the way, just some footnotes here. We did a TV special many years ago, CBS TV special, and they got all kinds of expert archaeological. They have found evidence that the Persians did have lions' dens, by the way. And there's this Persian custom has been archaeologically confirmed, apparently. But anyway, and the king commanded, and they brought these men which had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions. Get this, them, their children, and their wives. And the lions had mastery of them, and brake all their bones in pieces, or ever they came at the bottom of the den. Now these people, you find people saying, well, Daniel survived it because they had a bunch of old lions that weren't that hungry, and you have all these stupid conjectures. See, they're trying to say there's even a bigger miracle. Because after that, they threw 120 of these guys in there, and the lions apparently weren't satisfied till they got them all, and their wives and their kids. Lex talionis, eye for eye. This is the penalty for false witnesses. We see it here, and it's a term in the Aramaic for slander that's involved on these things. The term for slander is to eat the pieces of a man. There's an interesting link, and this is found in the Assyrian and Amarna letters. But anyway. It's interesting, when Daniel came out in the morning, he was the gainer. The king approved him. The king admired him. The king loved him. Everybody heard of it. And well, let's go on here and see. The king Darius wrote unto all the people, nations, and languages. Now you need to embrace this. You need to realize how big the empire was. This is bigger than the Babylonian Empire. Then the king Darius wrote unto all people, all nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth. I wouldn't get into a debate where that boundary is, but it certainly is extensive. What did he write? Peace be multiplied unto you. I make a decree. This is first person singular with Darius. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and steadfast forever. And his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall be even unto the end. What a statement. What a statement. He delivereth and rescueth, he worketh signs and wonders in heaven and in earth, who hath delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius, and even in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. It says, and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. It's possible that can be translated even in making Darius Cyrus. There are some people on the basis of this say that Darius could be one of the many titles of Cyrus. And I'm not here to debate that. There's some good scholars that believe that. There's some that have a different view, and that's fine. But in any case, so ends the thing. So, but I didn't want to let you go off this early, so I thought we'd raise some other issues. So there's some parallels here. As we look at this, the faithful remnant, prophetically, there is a faithful remnant in the end times. And a number, Dennett, Gabeline, Lang, Ironside, and a number of Newell and others, that use the lion den thing as a prophetic anticipatory type. Looking at that's pretty straightforward. Others feel it also foreshadows the man of sin, claiming divine honors under the penalty of death, which certainly he does in Revelation 7, 12, Matthew 24, Mark 13, and so forth. And it probably does. I'm not attracted to that because I don't really see Darius in that role. He got tricked, if you will. He wasn't, I don't see him in a sinister role here, strangely enough. We have to, of course, point out that God can deal with roaring lions. And there is a roaring lion that is going out to get you. 1 Peter 5:8. Who goes about as a roaring lion? Satan. So you may want to put 1 Peter 5:8 and 2 Timothy 4:17 in your notes. And, of course, Revelation 13:2. And, of course, as I quipped before, Daniel did not receive the mark of the beast. as the seal of the 144,000. They don't receive, they get sealed, so they don't receive the mark of the beast in Revelation chapter 7 and Revelation 14. Those are pretty straightforward for those of you that are looking at the prophetic typology possibilities here. But let's get more to practical lessons. What are the lessons of this famous event? Well, certainly safety and persecution. Now, we shouldn't get too comfortable. You know, it's funny how many people in America get all hung up about the Great Tribulation. Is the church going to go through tribulation now? Church is not going to go through that period called the Great Tribulation, I believe, but where do we get the arrogance to presume that we're going to be exempt from what most of the world for most of the last 1900 years has had to endure? It's called persecution. Not the Great Tribulation, that's a very specific thing. No, persecution. Now, in America, we've had 2 centuries of pretty comfortable going. It was founded by some very far-seated and very committed people. But we've allowed ourselves to yield, inch by inch, our heritage to those that are committed to separating us from that heritage. And as you watch the political process in this country in the recent decades, it looks like it's really on the skids. There are people that are out to separate you from your protections of freedom of worship, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech. And they're succeeding. The hate laws in Canada being a horrible example of this sort of thing. So safety and persecution may be a topic that's going to be far closer to all of us as time goes on here. The faithfulness of God is an issue here. Daniel didn't sweat it. He knew that God would take care of him. That doesn't mean he necessarily was going to survive the ordeal. There were people that trusted God that got voluntarily burned at the stake. And so we need to understand the faithfulness of God doesn't guarantee that God may not have a purpose in the result, a result that's a little different than we may be anticipating. But certainly the lessons here are inspiring, the inspiring faith of the one consecrated. Daniel's performance here is impressive. In fact, there's probably far more to learn about Daniel's commitment than there is about his surviving the ordeal. Because he survived the ordeal because God ordained it that it would. But in any case, his commitment, his faithfulness in not altering his pattern despite the laws that were being signed are impressive. Blessing, obeying God rather than men. All of us are going to have that challenge. It's coming up sooner than we probably recognize. And there is a reward of separation, separating yourself from the common. God is equal to every emergency. 1 Chronicles 22:13 is a key verse here. Thou shalt prosper if thou takest heed. That doesn't mean we should be ignorant. We should take heed, but we need to know what we're doing. But there's something else I want to talk about with this lesson that I think, well, it may surprise you. I want to talk about a group within the Persian Empire that were called the Magi of Medo-Persia. The word Magi is the Latinized form of Magoi, which is the ancient Greek transliteration of the Persian original. And the authority for that is Herodotus himself, the one that's called the father of history, Greek writer. But the Greek transliteration of the original Persian was Magoi, out of which we get the word Magi. And now, the reason this comes up, there were Magi in Nebuchadnezzar's court. They really are Persian derivatives, but don't get confused by this. Back in Jeremiah 39, in 2 verses 3 and 13, you'll discover that Rab Mag is a title of the chief of the Magi, and there was such a title in Nebuchadnezzar's court. Now here's a test question. Who was appointed to that position? Daniel, right. Now what you need to know about the Magi, it was a Persian sect. It was a hereditary Persian priesthood. Now can you get the picture here? The priests that were called Magi were hereditary. They were Median. They were Medes, right? And Nebuchadnezzar puts a Jew in charge. How do you think that went over? Not too well. Daniel's title was Rab Mag in Daniel 4, verse 9 and 5, verses 11. And it certainly endures as you get into the Persian Empire, because that's still all, if you realize that's still under the Babylonian jurisdiction. Let's talk a little bit about the Medo-Persian Empire, or Magi, I should say. Their skill was not astrology. There's somehow that myth occurs in a lot of your biblical helps. No, it's clear from Herodotus and other writers that their primary skill apparently was the interpretation of dreams. Does that sound familiar to anyone you know? Oneiromancy is the fancy word for dream interpretation. That was their key skill. Darius the Great established the Magi as the state religion of Persia. What occasioned this? After some Magi who were considered to be expert in the interpretation of dreams had been attached to the Median court. So that's kind of interesting. Who do you suppose was the leader of that gang? Could very well have been Daniel. I should correct something else, and this is out of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Zoroastrianism, which is the commonly associated with Persia, all this is before Zoroaster, by the way. That comes later. Many people don't realize this. Many commentators take for granted that Zoroastrianism is operative at this time. No, it actually comes later. It's interesting to notice that the Magian religion in Persia had a number of similarities to Judaism. When I say Judaism here, I mean Mosaic Judaism. Each had a monotheistic concept of one beneficent creator, author of all good, who in turn was opposed by a malevolent evil spirit. The dualism of Zoroastrianism and stuff comes later. Those of you who know about the Star Wars thing as a modernized or science fiction embellishment of dualism, that's all later. This is a monotheism against an evil spirit. Each has a hereditary priesthood. The Jews had the Levites and the Persians had the Medes. Each had its hereditary priesthood, which became the essential mediator between God and man by virtue of a blood sacrifice. In other words, that was true of, obviously the Jews were familiar with that because of our knowledge of the Old Testament, but it was also, they had a similar pattern among the Persians. Each depended upon the wisdom of the priesthood in divination. The kings always relied on the Magi as their counselors, just as the kings of Judah were to rely on the high priest and the Levites and so forth. Also, the Magian religion held concepts of clean and unclean forms of life. I think that's fascinating. Shouldn't surprise us because that goes back to Genesis, not just Moses. Each involved a hereditary priesthood serving several religions, and the Magi were a priestly caste during the Seleucid, Parthian, and Sasanian periods, and that they came later. But in any case, they were the Magi were a priestly caste. Okay? Are we together? Little political background you need to know. Well, something else you should have perspective here. Since the days of Daniel, the fortunes of Persia and the Jewish nation were closely interwoven. This is an observation by secular historians. Both nations had in their turn falling under the Seleucid domination in the wake of Alexander's conquest. Alexander died. His empire is divided among 4 key generals. This whole region is under the Seleucids, and both the Jews and the Persians suffered under the Seleucids. So they had that in common. They had a common enemy. Both had regained their independence. The Jews did under the Maccabean leadership by the time you get to the New Testament period, and the Persians as the dominating ruling group within the Parthian Empire. Now, one of the things you want to get a picture, most of us know a lot about the Roman Empire for 2 reasons. It's so operative in the New Testament period, and also because of our Western Europe traditions. Many of us are ignorant of, okay, the Persian Empire was succeeded by the Greeks and the Romans, but there was still an eastern part of that was called the Parthian Empire, and it turns out to be a rival to Rome in the east. Rome and Parthia are constantly fighting each other, and we're going to talk about that because it's important for us. See, it was at this time that the Magi had a dual role. They were priests, but they were also had governmental, you combined the priesthood and certain administration things. The Magi composed the upper house of the council of the Magistanes, or what we would call the magistrates. That's where the word comes from. The magistrate is a mix of the priestly function and the administrative function in one office. You get the idea? Whose duties included, among other things, the absolute choice and election of the king. When the king was to be replaced, the Magi picked the king. You get the picture? That's important to understand because there's some things you won't understand unless you have this background. Magistrates. See, it was in this dual capacity as priest and counselor, which evolves into the civil and political council that was invested with religious authority. Thus, the Magi became the supreme priestly caste of the Persian Empire and then the Parthian Empire. And incidentally, many of you may be familiar with the inscription at Bisitun. Just as the Rosetta Stone is so important in understanding languages, because it's the same thing written in 3 different languages, you all know about the Rosetta Stone, there's also a similar kind of thing. It's actually on some cliffs. It's huge. You have to scale up there to get it. But Darius the Great, had this done. It's written in 3 languages: Elamite, Akkadian or Babylonian, and Old Persian or Aramaic. And because it's in 3 languages, it's been a key translation aid when they discovered this thing. And the point is that most people know about it because of its linguistic significance. But what is it that they're talking about in these 3 languages? It speaks of Darius' speedy and final triumph over a revolt of the Magi in 522. So, in other words, these Magi became too big for their britches, had a revolt, he put them down. But again, it testifies to the power of this group. Incidental, but let's go on. Let's talk about the Parthian Empire. It's an ancient empire of Asia which includes what we call today Iran and Afghanistan. But this is east, if you will, of the Roman Empire proper. The Parthians primarily were of Scythian descent, and they adopted Median dress and Aryan speech. So they're a distinctive people. And Parthia was subject successfully to the Assyrians, the Medes, the Persians, the Macedonians under Alexander the Great, and then the Seleucids, as I mentioned before. Let's get down to about 250 BC. The Parthians by then had succeeded, this is after the Persian Empire, in succeeding in founding an independent kingdom. And during about the 1st century BC, they grew into an empire extending from the Euphrates to the Indus River and from the Oxus River down to the Indian Ocean. So that whole region that was the eastern extreme of Alexander the Great's empire emerges as the Parthian Empire. In the middle of the 1st century BC, Parthia thus, I want you to understand, is a rival of Rome. And there were wars between the Parthians and the Romans. They're relatively inconclusive. Neither one really dominates the other. Judea is right between these guys. So Judea is a buffer zone, and we need to understand the degree at which it was. See, Pompey was the first Roman conqueror of Jerusalem in 63 BC, and he attacked the Armenian outpost of Parthia. In 55 BC, Crassus led the Roman legions in sacking Jerusalem and in a subsequent attack on Parthia proper, but he gets clobbered. The Romans were decisively defeated in the Battle of Carrhae with a loss of 30,000 troops, including their commander. So the Romans really got clobbered. The Parthians counterattacked with a token invasion of Armenia, Syria, and Palestine. Got the picture so far? Okay. Nominal Roman rule is reestablished under Antipater, the father of Herod, who in turn retreated before a Parthian invasion in 40 BC. So the Romans reestablished it, but then had to retreat. That retreat's important to understand. Mark Antony reestablishes the Roman sovereignty in 37 BC, and like Crassus, I misspelled it, Crassus before him, he also embarked on a similarly ill-fated Parthian expedition. And his disaster, here's a second disastrous retreat. It was followed by another wave of invading Parthians, which swept the Roman opposition completely out of Palestine. And by the way, Herod himself, who had to flee to Alexandria, that's Egypt, and then to Rome, because the Parthians dominated that area. With the Parthian collaboration, Jewish sovereignty was restored and Jerusalem was fortified with a Jewish garrison. Herod, by this time, secured from Augustus Caesar the title King of the Jews. But it's empty. He's in Rome. He's not there. He just got the credentials, so to speak, okay? It was not for 3 years, including a 5-month siege by the Roman troops, that the King Herod, was able to occupy his own capital city. What I'm trying to portray here, what you need to understand that we always say King Herod was in charge of Jerusalem. Yeah, he was on a slippery rock. He was there and he wasn't, depending on how the wind was blowing between the Romans and the Parthians. So he had thus gained the throne of a rebellious buffer state situated between two mighty contending empires. You talk about a thankless job. He goes there, and first of all, it's a rebellious state in itself, and it's a pawn between these two giant forces. How do you operate? Very carefully. At any time, his own subjects might conspire in bringing the Parthians to their aid. Understand that the sympathies of the Jews would be with the Parthians because they're comfortable with them. So he would be justified in treating the Jews with great distrust because he's got this pawn between these two big guys, and he knows that his subjects are partial to the one group, not the group that's sponsoring him. Now, meanwhile, Augustus is getting old, and since Tiberius had retired, so there's no experienced military commander in Rome. So they're in a transition period here. Now, Armenia is pro-Parthia, just like the Jews were, and they're starting to foment a revolution. In fact, 2 years from now, they're going to succeed in that revolution. But in the meantime, you can smell it coming. You get the picture. If you're Roman, you got some problems. Augustus is getting old. Tiberius is retired. No experienced commander around. And one of your key provinces down there is getting ready to revolt, quite apart from all the problems in Judea. And by the way, about the time of birth of Christ, Herod himself was close to his final days. He's not in good health. So this is the setting. Oh, and by the way, that's the Roman side. Let's talk about Parthia. Parthia's got its problems. The time was ripe for another Parthian invasion of these buffer provinces like Judea, except for the fact that Parthia itself had all kinds of internal tensions. Ephraites IV, who was the unpopular and aging king, had once been deposed already, and it was not improbable that the Persian Magi were already involved in the political maneuvering requisite to choosing a successor to him. So as you look at Rome, it's unstable. You look at Parthia, and it's got its internal problems. It's possible that the Magi might have taken advantage of the king's lack of popularity to further their own interests with the establishment of a new dynasty if a sufficiently strong contender could be found. That's the climate. Okay, now we're going to shift, the camera's going to shift to Jerusalem, okay? There's a very precarious visit here. Suddenly, a group of Persian Parthian kingmakers entered Jerusalem in the latter days of the reign of Herod. And these are not three guys on camels. The Magi traveling in force with unimaginable pomp and ceremony. You understand how the Persians played the game. They were intimidating. They didn't have a budget for this sort of thing. It was open. Right? Unimaginable pomp and adequate cavalry escort to ensure their safe penetration of the Roman territory. You can imagine why not just Herod, but the whole city is in an uproar. If you look at Matthew chapter 2, verse 3, all of Jerusalem is unsettled by this. Isn't three guys riding camels coming in. This was a major military escort. Now, with this political background, you can understand why Herod is nervous. He doesn't know what's going on here. He's on a slippery rock. His Roman support is nervous. He's got Parthian in turmoil, and he's right in the middle of this, and suddenly this gang comes with enough force to be safe themselves. His reaction is understandable. One of fear. Terror might be a bit more descriptive. And when you consider the rivalry of Rome and the Parthia that prevailed during his lifetime, you can understand why he didn't know what's going on. Let's take a look now with this background at Matthew chapter 2. Now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem. These are the Magi. The wise men thing is a broad category. Specifically, they're Magi. Most people know they're Magi. They don't know what Magi are. And these guys came saying, where is he that is born King of the Jews? Now you got to stop right there. You need to understand that is a calculated insult to the guy that contrived and bribed his way into his office. Herod was not born king of anything. He was a political appointee from Rome, and Rome's a long way away right now. These guys come in, the rival to Rome, say, where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and are come to worship him. Really? These Persian priests with their military escort have arrived, and don't expect to find him in a manger, because when Herod goes after the kids later, he goes those that are 2 years and younger. So by this time, we assume, Mary and Joseph have gotten out of the manger, they finally found, a bed and breakfast place to... Okay. Now, it's interesting. You've got to put yourself in Herod's place here. When Herod the king heard these things, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Jerusalem's in uproar. What's going on? And here they're asking about something he didn't know anything about. He's not Jewish. He's Edomite. And what does he do? He consults. When he gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he demanded of them where Christ should be born. So he understands what they're talking about. King of the Jews, the Christ, the Anointed One, the Messiah. These guys think he's been born around here somewhere. Where is he supposed to be born? And what did? They didn't consult the stars. They didn't consult astrology. They went to the Tanakh, the Holy Word of God. He said unto him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet. And they quote Micah chapter 5, verse 2. You know all the thing. You've seen it on your Christmas cards. And thou, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, art not the least among the princes of Judah, for out of thee shall come a governor that shall rule my people in Israel. If you read Micah 5:2, it says a lot more than that. Whose goings forth have been forever. In other words, he's pre-existent. But anyway, he's born. But the main point they're after by this quote is, where is he destined to be born? In Bethlehem. That's not a surprise. It was written for five centuries earlier by Micah. And they were able to go to their database and find that out and tell the king. And the king conveys that to these guys. Then Herod, when he had privately called the wise men, inquired of them diligently what time the star appeared. See, so he assumes that when the star appears when the child was born, okay? And so you'll find out that Herod concludes that it's within 2 years. Because later on, he's going to kill all the babies that are 2 years old and younger. Follow me? So these guys have been traveling for a while. They saw the star, got their act together, been traveling. So who knows exactly how long it is, but it's so many months in any case. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search diligently for the young child, and when ye have found him, bring me word again, that I may come and worship him also. You don't want any worship like he has in mind. No. So but you notice how he's treating these guys with deference. He's tiptoeing. He's trying to be the good guy. He's not challenging them. He doesn't say, why do you want to know that? He doesn't, do any due diligence. He's going with the flow here. And when they had heard the king, they departed. And lo, the star which they saw in the east went before them, till it came and stood over where the young child was. This was not a star in the astronaut. I have seen more planetarium shows where they conjecture that it was Kepler started this back in the 16th century, that it was a conjunction between Saturn and Jupiter and all that. No, this is not a star that you're going to find in an ephemeris. No, this star. And by the way, the star didn't tell them it was Bethlehem. If they were triangulating with astronomy, with a sextant or its equivalent, an astrolabe, they wouldn't have gone to Jerusalem. They would have gone to Bethlehem. They had to go to Jerusalem and acquire the messianic expectation. When they'd done that, the star leads them specifically right over where the child was. This is a supernatural phenomenon. It's not some astronomical predictable thing. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. And when they were come into the house, notice it's a house, it's no longer a cave or a manger or whatever. When they came into the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. How did they know? How did they know when this star appeared, whatever it was, that they were to go and worship him? How did they know they were to bring gold, myrrh, and frankincense? How did they know that? How did they know they were any significance to this baby that's in this family's arms? How do they know that? I'll tell you how I believe they know. There's a number of scholars that suspect, we can't prove this, but we believe, that in the days of Daniel, when he was in charge of the Magi, he established a cabal, an inside group he could trust, and shared with them Daniel chapter 9, among other things. They would know when the time was coming by counting days, because when you get to Daniel 9, you'll discover that Gabriel told Daniel a lot of specifics. He may have told Daniel far more than is recorded, but by the way, by what's recorded, you can put together the instructions that Daniel probably gave this group to secretly protect until the time came. And what you're seeing here are not all the magi. You're seeing a group of magi to whom were entrusted a mission. And so they came. And they brought 3 gifts. What were the 3 gifts? Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Gold for his deity, frankincense, which is the material of priesthood, and myrrh, which is embalming for death. Something very interesting, when you study the millennium in Isaiah and elsewhere, you'll discover that they give him gifts there too. They give him gold and frankincense, but no myrrh, because the death is behind him. It's done. It's a done deal. Tetelestai, it is finished. So when they were coming to the house, they saw the young child with Mary's mother, fell down and worshipped him, and when they had opened their treasures, they presented unto him gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Now, because there's 3 gifts, it has been presumed by the Jesus Seminar type of people back then that there must have been 3 guys. We'll talk a little bit about some of the traditions here in a minute. Now, they were warned of God in a dream. You know, it's interesting that God communicates to them in the way they're most comfortable with. They were experts in environmency, and that's what they dealt with. Daniel apparently trained them that way. And so anyway, in the form of a dream, and that they should go back to their country without responding to Herod. And that's what they did. They warned of God in a dream that they should not return to Herod. They departed into their own country another way. And that's great news. As an incidental footnote that I found interesting, within 2 years, the Phraatesses, the parricide son of Phraates IV, was installed by the Magi as the new ruler in Parthia. So Herod's conjectures were probably sound, in the sense the Magi were on the prowl for a new leader. Not these guys, they had a mission for Christ. But the point is, the political setup was that the Magi were already facing the issue of finding a new dynasty, and they did that within 2 years. So interesting. Let's talk a little bit about the Magi traditions. The Eastern Church, you know, it's funny, we in the West are so obviously products of the Reformation and what have you, but the Eastern Church has a number of traditions that are different. Their Eastern tradition is that there were not 3, there were 12. I'm not saying there were 12, I just think it's interesting that they have a tradition of 12. And their Christmas, by the way, they arrive on Christmas Day, but their Christmas Day is January 6th. 12th day of Christmas, you ever wonder where that comes from? You've all heard the song, you're probably tired of hearing the song, 12 Days of Christmas. Well, and Marty Goetz, the wonderful gospel singer, has a wonderful thing he does from his Jewishness. And he talks about how, as he grew up he's a Christian, but as he grew up as a Jew, he was so glad that they had Hanukkah, because they got 8 days we have against our Christmas. And he loved it until he found out that we have 12. You know, and he makes a joke of all that. But anyway, but at Eastern, they do. Chase Manhattan Bank had me take over a company that had a software department on a critical project and so forth, and we had a crash program for the National Security Agency to finish something by a certain date and so forth, and we were subject to some espionage that gave us a setback. And I remember telling my board of directors, which included the top guy from Chase Manhattan, top guy from Heisercorp, it was a public company, but it was dominated by the bank's holdings. But anyway, that our software crew worked right through Christmas to get the software finished in order to make the timing. And then I finally had to admit to them, I should explain them, they were all Eastern Orthodox. Their Christmas is January 6th, not December 25th. So we gave them their Christmas off. But anyway, I was able to party that a little bit among my board. Anyway, in the 3rd centuries, when we first begin to hear them described as kings bearing gifts. They're not kings, they're Magi's, but Psalm 72 and 68 have sort of lose that. The Western tradition, in contrast to the Eastern tradition, that there's 3 of these guys, that's where we get 3 kings. They're called kings by some songs and things. And there are 3 because of 3 gifts, and we call it Epiphany, which is January 6th. It's interesting that both those traditions have the January 6th as the date. But by the 6th century, not only are they 3, but these 3 have names. And depending on whether you're talking about which language, the Greek or whatever, Balthasar, Melchior, and Gaspar are the names that are given. So these, you'll see books that talk about this as having names. Abidi in the 7th century feels that the three were probably representatives of the three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, thus representing Asia, Africa, and Europe. These are all just traditions that are obviously many centuries after the fact. They're just very colorful. In the 14th century, there was an Armenian tradition, Balthazar and Melchior and Gaspar were the king of Arabia, Persia, and India. And so it's a little Eastern. But again, all these are simply traditions. Now, there are relics that were attributed to them in the 4th century that were transferred in the 5th century to Constantinople and then to Milan and then to Cologne in the 12th century, where they're still there today. So you'll find, if you go through museums, you'll find things that are attributed to the ancient Magi. But the other thing that comes up in these discussions is the so-called Star of Bethlehem. Now, some people like to point to Balaam's prophecy in Numbers 24, verse 17, where it speaks of a star coming out of Jacob. The problem with that, I'm not here to disparage it, and yet both Numbers 24, 17 and Isaiah 60, verse 3, which sounds like this, were not quoted by Matthew. And my presumption was if they had a scriptural link, Matthew would have quoted it, and he didn't. So I think you're on really just speculative ground to play those games. There are all these astronomers that like to conjecture about conjunctions. Kepler is the first guy, the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in the constellation Pisces in 7 BC. Now, he does that from an erroneous inference from Josephus. And by the way, he still has the wrong date because it's got to be somewhere between the 2 and 4 BC from some other considerations. People keep asking me, because they know I have a hobby in astronomy, what about the Star of Bethlehem? I don't expect it to have any astronomical reference at all. Because if it did, it would destroy its role, which is as a supernatural event heralding the supernatural birth of Jesus Christ. It's settled over a specific location. So I don't look for astronomical, every December in the astronomy magazine there's always, some collection of these different conjectures. None of them make any sense anyway, by the way, but it wouldn't impress me if they did. So that's a quick snapshot of Daniel chapter 6. And once you know the background of the Magi and you realize that Daniel was put in charge of this hereditary priesthood, you get a couple of insights. Number one, it just fuels this perception that he was delivered up for envy, but also he was also in a position to establish a highly classified project, highly secure project of taking some students that he could trust and entrust with them a mission. He would also know how long it would take. He knew in advance the exact day that Jesus was going to present himself as a king to Jerusalem, because Gabriel told him, and we'll explore all of that when we get to chapter 9. So when you put that all together, this view that the Magi were the result of a cabal that was established by Daniel some 5 centuries earlier makes all the sense in the world. But I thought you'd enjoy that as a footnote or an appendix to the lion's den story. I think Daniel suffers more from the critics den than he does the lion's den, but that's neither here nor there. Let's stand for a closing word of prayer. For next time, I want you to read chapter 7 and be ready for some real surprises. We have just crossed over a major barrier. The first 6 chapters of Daniel are narrative, are history. Yes, they involve visions, but they're basically a chronicle of history. The lion's den was an event. Chapter 7 is the last of these chapters. That's in Aramaic. It's Gentile, but it's all prophecy. Chapter 8 will shift back to Hebrew, but chapters 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11, and 12, the next 6 chapters, are prophecies. The last 3 being the most phenomenal prophecies you can imagine in terms of end times, but the most breathtaking chapter in the entire Bible is chapter 9 that we're working our way up to. So read chapter 7 when you get a chance, and if you have extra time, review chapter 2. And with that, let's have a closing word of prayer. Well, Father, we thank you for who you are, and we thank you for the faithfulness of your servant Daniel. What an example he gives us. What a blessing he gives us. We thank you, Father, for providing these examples to us. Oh, Father, if you would, through your Holy Spirit, help us to emulate Daniel. His faithfulness in prayer 3 times a day. Oh, Father, we hear you. We thank you, Father, that he insisted upon serving you rather than men, that we too might have the resolve, that might have the courage to finish well. Oh, Father, we know so many start wonderfully. So many start seriously and committed But Daniel endured to the end. As a teenager, in the throes of the Babylonian idolatry and the turmoil of the Persian Empire, he stands like a beacon. Father, we just thank you for his testimony. And we would ask, Father, that you would help us in our own small ways to be effective as he was. We recognize, Father, that not taking your name in vain is a command of ambassadorship, not vocabulary. As we take your name, Father, help us to be discerning and help us to be resolved to be your ambassadors as Daniel was. And Father, we would ask too that you would illuminate that path before us, that we might know what you would have of each of us in the days that remain. We know that the night is coming, Father. Help us to be prepared. Help us to be effective. But in all things, Father, help us to be fruitful for you and more pleasing in thy sight as we commit ourselves into your hands in the name of Yeshua, our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Okie dokie. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that and got some real insight into who the Magi were, and hopefully brought the Christmas story into better perspective for everybody. I remember how interested I was to find out that rather than 3 guys riding in on a camel, we had a group of kingmakers with their small army, their military escort, that was ready, willing, and able to fight their way in and out of enemy territory. Gee. And while we have tradition that, we 3 kings of Orient are and all that kind of stuff, this is nothing that said that there were 3 of them. They might have been, who knows, might have been 3, might have been 30 of the Magi, but there were certainly several hundred of their military escort.
Wasn't SEAL Team 1?
Yeah, SEAL Team 1, exactly. Their military escort, fully armed and headed into enemy territory. So this was territory. The Parthians and the Romans had been wrestling over this very territory for more than a decade. And when I say wrestling, I mean sometimes the Parthians would take over Judea, and sometimes the Romans would kick them out and take over, and they went back and forth and back and forth. So you can kind of feel the lump in Herod's throat when he saw these guys marching in. And Scripture tells us that all Jerusalem was shaken. Well, gee, I guess so, because the last time this had happened, they had conquered Jerusalem and said, okay, dude, you guys are now Parthians. Start paying tribute. I personally find that to be fascinating. So, any insights or anything new that somebody found or have an aha moment? Or
We
okay.
live it pretty cushy.
I'm sorry?
We live it pretty cushy. We don't have to worry about the lion's den.
We live it pretty cushy. That is a very, very astute statement. And, you know, how many times do we think, well, gee, this just happened to me, or that happened, or I agree with you. We have it pretty cushy. So we'll start with the questions for session 7. Question number 1, according to this study, King Darius was the only person who was above the law of the Medes and the Persians. Is that true or false?
Nobody was above the law.
What's that?
None of them were above the law.
No one was above the law.
Well, Nebuchadnezzar was.
Right,
He was dead.
right. He was Babylonian, not Persian.
Right.
So yes, the answer to number 1 is false. That's correct. Question number 2, the presidents and princes of the Babylonian Empire said, quote, "We shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God," end quote. Is that true or false? I like the fact that Chuck really emphasized that part. How many of us, if we had our, 100 of our closest friends, neighbors, and coworkers, how many of us would expect for others to say of us, we can't find anything wrong with this person?
Kind of like our government, find me a man, I'll find a crime.
Yeah, right. That's Beria from the Soviet Union, but yeah, it's become our government. That's true. Question number 3. According to this study, the Magian religion and Judaism have many concepts in common. Is that true or false?
True.
It is true, and perhaps I'm alone, but I find that to be very interesting that those commonalities exist.
I didn't know it until tonight.
Yeah. So we did learn something, you and I, didn't we, sweetie?
Yes.
There you go. Question number 4. The inscriptions of Bisitun was written on how many in how many languages? A, a single language. B, 2 languages. C, 3 languages. D, 4 languages. Bueller.
3.
Bueller. We've got 3. We've got 3. Anybody with me that says it was written in 4? Oh, I was wrong. It was written in 3. You're right. Yep. 3 languages. What were the languages?
One of them was Akkadian /
Babylonian.
Babylonian, and one was Persian, I think. I don't know what the other one was.
Human.
Pig Latin.
Now that's funny that you say that because you just stole my joke. Question number 5. Daniel was not hurt by the lions because of which of the following? A, he prayed to God. B, he believed and trusted in God. C, he led a religious life. D, none of the above.
I believe it was B.
We have a B. Anybody else? Yep, the answer is B. There was another thing that I was struck when Chuck stressed the difference between belief and faith. You know, it's not enough to believe in God. Satan believes in God. It's your belief and your faith, right? I mean, his as he says, his clumsy analogy is, you believe that chair will hold you, but it's your faith that causes you to actually trust in that and sit in the chair to verify that it will. So belief and faith are two completely separate things. Perhaps related, but certainly separate. 6, in the Daniel 6 narrative, who encouraged Daniel? Was it A, the Holy Spirit, B, King Darius, C, the Chaldeans, or D, none of the above?
Okay.
King Darius. What do you think of that? The guy that threw him into the lion's den says, hey, don't worry. You're going to come out of this okay. Because he had been set up by his own counselors. What were you going to say, sweetie?
He didn't have a choice. He had to follow the law that he put in place.
That's another thing that when I first went through this session many, many times ago, I thought a king is a king, right? Not in some cultures. And we know he felt like he was set up, because what's the first thing he did when Daniel came out? He said, okay, you guys that did this to me, you got me on this one, but I think I'm going to have the last laugh on this whole deal. As a friend of mine, as a friend of mine would say, hold my beer. So yes, it was King Darius that encouraged Daniel. In 7, according to this study, Darius could have been which of the following? Could have been Cyrus himself, that's A. B, could have been Cambyses, son of Cyrus. Could have been Darius, an appointment. Or D, all of the above. We've got an all of the above. Does anybody want to argue with that? The answer is D, all the above, because scholars are not quite sure if who Darius was. And by that, I don't mean that they don't know, but Darius could have been a title rather than the name of a person, right? So it could have been Cyrus, it could have been Cambyses, it could have been a variety of folks. 8, at the time of Christ's birth, Judea was a military buffer zone between which of the following kingdoms? A, Assyria and Egypt. B, Parthia and Rome. C, Babylon and Rome. Or D, none of the above.
None of the above.
We got a none of the above, and we got a B, okay?
B.
We got a B, 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 B. It was B, because we had, remember?
What was B?
Yeah, B, Parthia and Rome. It was, well, first it was Babylon, then it was Persia, and Persia kind of fell apart, and Parthia took over the eastern half of the Persian Empire, and the Romans took over the western half of the Persian Empire, and a whole lot more as well. And it was Parthia, the eastern remnant of the Persian Empire, and Rome that were going head to head. So yeah, and by the way, Parthia is misspelled in mine. 9, according to this study, the lion's den was double sealed for which of the following reasons? A, so Daniel could not get out. B, so King Darius could not let Daniel out. C, so more lions could not get into the den. Or D, none of the above. B, B as in Bravo? B, 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 B? Interesting. So I'm getting the feeling here from the answers to several of these questions that King Darius was a little bit miffed about this whole thing, about being hoodwinked into this. And they thought that if he could, or if they gave him the slightest chance, he'd have sprung Daniel.
I think he was Daniel's friend.
I think he might have been. He was certainly an admirer of Daniel.
I
And
think he feared Daniel's God.
I don't doubt that you're right. And I think you make an excellent point, because we know that when he personally marched Daniel, so he tried all afternoon to see if he couldn't find a way to spring him out of this whole thing, and he couldn't. He didn't have good enough lawyers to be able to get him out of it. So Darius personally collected Daniel and marched him in and said, "Buck up, buddy, it's going to be okay." And what did he say? Who did he say was going to help him? Who did Darius say was going to help Daniel?
His God.
What do you think about them apples? You're right. Darius says your God is the Lord of the world, and he's going to help you out of this deal.
So he was a believer.
Well, at least to that.
Got the faith yet.
At least to that extent, he certainly did. Well, maybe he did, because he was the one that marched him into the lion's den. And then what did he do the next morning? He's the guy that hustled. He can't sleep, can't eat, and he's the guy that gets up at dark 30, hustles down, and he starts yelling, "Hey, Daniel." 10, according to this study, Herod was troubled at the arrival of the Magi because of which of the following reasons? A, the time was right for another Parthian invasion. We just talked about that. There had been several Parthian invasions. Or B, Herod may have been close to his final illness. He was kind of sickly and in poor health. C, the Magi were looking for he who was, quote unquote, born King of the Jews. Wow. So Herod has had Caesar Augustus in this case. He's wheedled and cajoled and bribed and he's gotten Augustus, who is also elderly at this point, to proclaim that Herod is king of Judea, right? I mean, he's not even Jewish. He's from Edom. He's an Edomite. But he's gotten the royal decree that he is the king of Judea. And then this small army of kingmakers, because that's who the Magi were, they were the kingmakers, march in and say, "Hey, we want to know who's really king of the Jews." Man, whap, whap, whap. And it ain't you. Wow. So, according to this study, Herod was troubled at the arrival of the Magi because of which of the following reasons? A, the time was ripe for another Parthian invasion. B, Herod may have been close to his final illness. C, the Magi were looking for he who was born King of the Jews. Or D, all of the above.
I think it was B, but I think it could be all of them.
Yeah,
We got a B or an all?
I was at A and C, so that's not gonna.
A and C?
That's not one of these.
Well, you're both right. Okay.
So it's all of the above.
It is all of the above. Yeah. It is all of the above, because the time was ripe for another Parthian invasion. Herod was elderly and poorly, and the Magi were looking for. I still can't believe it. You go into the king's. You meet with a king. You have an audience with a king. King's sitting here, knees knocking while he's having an audience to say, "Hey, we're looking for the." You go to the king. You say, "We're looking for the real king." Wow.
They knew how to bust ego.
Yeah. And you think?
But he saw that as we're looking for the next king.
Well.
And he looked at that as somebody that's gonna take my throne from
You
me.
fixing to
You
go
think?
bye-bye.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So we've got some discussion questions here. What does the lion's den have to do with Christmas? How did the Magi know to look for the star, to bring gold, myrrh, and frankincense, and to worship Jesus? How'd they know all that stuff?
It was written in the Old Testament.
Tanakh.
Well, yeah, assuming, but, and yes, while that's true, it wouldn't have been my first guess that the religious leaders of a different competing religion would have spent much time reading through the Tanakh to glean all that stuff. I mean, it's certainly possible, but that would not have been my first thought. Anybody else have any thoughts on how that came to be?
So what was the question again?
So, what does the lion's den have to do with Christmas? And how did the Magi, that's your clue, by the way, and how did the Magi know to look for the star and to bring gold, myrrh, and frankincense to worship Jesus? I'll tell you the whole key of the whole thing is, what's it got to do with Christmas? Go ahead.
I was gonna say,
Or what's the lion's den got to do with Christmas?
The Magi.
yeah.
What's that?
Daniel was over the Magi, and he'd been teaching them all those years.
That's the key. And that's what most people don't really, most people think of the Magi as 3 bumpkins on camels, right? They weren't. We don't even know that there were 3, but regardless of how many of them there were, these guys were royal kingmakers. They were both priests and high up officials. What did you say?
Administrator.
High up administrators, and they were. This can't be overstated. They were the guys who decided who's the next king of Parthia going to be.
Did they have like a puff of white smoke? Sorry.
Yeah, exactly. So these were very powerful dudes. Whether there were 3 or 6 or 12 or how many, it doesn't make any difference. And it was Daniel who, several centuries before, had been, the Jewish fella had been put in charge of this hereditary Mede sect. And so, yes, you guys are right. It was Daniel, the guy who was in charge all those years ago, who said, here's what you need to look for. Because remember, it was also Daniel, we haven't gotten to this yet, this is the second half of Daniel, that Daniel is going to lay out or prophesy the next 400 years. All right? So the next half a dozen chapters that we're going to, the balance of the book of Daniel is prophecy and all the stuff that we've been told about the 400 silent years between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament is not correct, because it is all laid out in the last 6 chapters of Daniel. And so the guy that could lay out what's going to happen for the next 400 years also laid it out to the Medes and said, okay, when you see, here's about how long it's going to, not about, here's what to look for, here's how long it's going to take on such and such a date. Pack up your camels and your entourage and head out. Was Darius the Mede the same as Cyrus or a different person? Give your answer and explain why or why not.
I don't know that we really know.
Yeah, my answer is no. Does it matter?
No.
I mean, for our purposes, anybody got a different answer?
I'm just wondering why it was left kind of questionable, that it wasn't clear. Is there something missed? Just a word or two that doesn't clearly say this was Darius and this is not? Or it's like it's blurred.
I
find
think
odd.
you make a good point, but if you stop and think about it, there are a number of items in the Bible that are ambiguous. There are the core precepts which are laid out crystal clear. And then there's kind of the the extra stuff.
Fringe.
Right. That is not hit too hard. As an example, they talk about, in some earlier chapters, they were talking about how the father of Belshazzar, the king's great Belshazzar. Yeah. Anyway,
They're close, the names are really close.
right. So the father, right, said this, that, something or other else. And so when I was reading this before Chuck's instruction here, I thought, okay, the father was the guy that was his dad and his mom had him. Chuck points out, no, it was actually his grandfather, but in several languages, including Babylonian, there is no word for father, grandfather. It's forebearer, right? So we think of it as father like our direct descendant. So there are some ambiguities, but not in the core precepts. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Topic number 3. Chuck Missler gives 6 lessons taken from Daniel 6. Elaborate briefly on all 6 lessons and give a 7th lesson God may have taught you. This is where we lean on Jerry to tell us what those 6 were.
No, I don't think we should do that.
Did anybody write down what the 6 lessons were? Okay, let's pretend like we answered them and move on.
Thank you.
I'm not sure what the 6 lessons were, so I'd have to go back and reread this. We'll see if Elizabeth is watching, and she might be able to tell us, but she hasn't, so we'll move on. 4, Daniel prayed 3 times daily with his window open toward Jerusalem. Paul tells us to, quote, pray without ceasing, end quote, from 1 Thessalonians 5. Which of these true prayer methods is correct?
Both. That was an easy one. Both.
We got a both?
I agree.
So are you going to get in trouble if you pray more than 3 times?
No.
Oh. I like the little anecdote that Chuck gives where he talks about you can pray in your car. Basically, pray without ceasing doesn't mean that you don't do anything but pray. It just means throughout the day when the Spirit is upon you, you feel the need or are compelled, pray. You don't have to have a certain set time. Yes?
Wasn't it Daniel that prayed for days before, the Gabriel, the angel came? Who was it that
But he
prayed?
definitely prayed overnight. He called his prayer group together when he needed that vision.
Yeah.
And that was one of those overnight prayer things.
Yeah. So I guess it determines the situation.
So I mean, you can. I interpret that to be on as needed,
Yeah.
right?
Situation.
Yeah. But it turns out, from Chuck's explanation, it was his habit to pray morning, noon, and nighttime in any event. And the fact that Darius had been tricked into issuing an edict that forbade that, he's got his issues, I got mine. I'm just going to keep on doing what I'm going to do. It didn't phase. That's really something. Didn't phase him a bit. He said, "Oh, he signed an edict that he's going to put me to death, throw me in the lion's den. Okay, I guess I'll pray." Wow. I need to pray, but that's right. That's faith.
That's
We'll test that chair right now.
That's right.
5, compare and contrast the Magian religion and Judaism. Well, we could compare They were both monotheistic. They both had a single God, right? Anybody else remember? They had blood sacrifices. That's right. Anything else? They both had a bad guy that was trying to. They had their God that was trying to. They looked for salvation, and they had a bad guy that was trying to trip them up and devour them. Pretty cool, actually.
So was the Magian religion more dualism? Or was it,
Do you mean, do they have a triune God, or?
well, dualism is where you've got good and you got a God and you got Satan and they're both co-equal. Right?
I don't.
So neither one's more powerful than the other, or, right? And that's what dualism is. And so it looks a lot like ours, except that ours, our evil spirit was created and fell. Dualism has both good and evil created coexistent.
And I don't know the answer to that. To my mind, you'd have to have.
Well, it doesn't matter because it still falls apart.
Well, that's right. But I would think you'd have to have. If I'm going to pray to a God, he better be more powerful than the bad guy. Otherwise, what's the point?
That's right.
Exactly.
6, summarize the issues concerning Judea as a buffer state at the time of Christ's birth.
Well, it sounded like the Hatfields and McCoys were at it again.
That's exactly true. You talk about an area and a people, in this case the Jews, that were constantly whipsawed back and forth.
Yeah.
Basically, they were on pins and needles the whole time. Okay, we're going to get punched around here. Is it going to be the Parthians this time, or is it going to be the Romans? We're going to be under attack any day now. See any parallels to Israel of today?
Yeah.
Gee, is Hamas going to launch some rockets, or is it going to be Hezbollah?
Yes.
Oh, so I'm sorry. I'm sorry. It was Iran.
Both?
A little
Above.
That's right, exactly.
a little editorial insertion here. The whole incident that was sparked by the October 7th massacre by Hamas of Israel,
War?
the war, didn't really work out the way that didn't really work out the way anybody anticipated it would, if you stop and think about it.
For me, that was,
Did you anticipate that the U.S. government would try and subdue Israel and withhold weapons from them and try and trip them up?
Oh, absolutely.
What's that?
Absolutely. It's a mess. And for anything coming, or no surprises.
I was surprised because the United States has been the staunch ally and sometimes the only staunch ally of Israel since its inception in 1947. I was not naive enough to not recognize that our support had been slacking or lessening, particularly during administrations of a certain political party. But it came as a surprise to me that political party would have been so completely ignorant to say, no, they've just fired 2,000 rockets at you, and we're trying to dissuade you from retaliating. It needs to be a proportional response. No, and this whole myth right now, I mean, the Hamas came over, massacred 1,200 Israelis, on Israeli soil, by the way.
100 hostages.
Yeah, wasn't it 120? I mean, it was a
Still there.
whole bunch of hostages. And they didn't. It wasn't even that they just shot people. I mean, they raped and mutilated and sliced and all the rest of that kind of.
Babies.
And then when the Hamas fighters came back with their hostages, then what happened? When they were on their return, what happened? They were celebrated by the people of Gaza.
But the evil is not even, they're not even trying to hide it anymore. It's just blatant.
Absolutely. And it is Gaza, the quote unquote Palestinians, that the United States has been supporting with hundreds of millions of dollars over the last 30 years. It is the Israelis that have bent over backwards not to be proportionate, not to go in with too heavy a hand. And what was it, Jerry? 15 years ago, the Israelis who had occupied Gaza to try and keep the peace, under pressure from the United States and the UN, finally pulled all Israeli troops and Israeli citizens out of Gaza, handed them over desalination plants in one of the largest greenhouses in the world, greenhouse complexes, I should say.
They were supplying their water, their electricity,
That's right.
the food.
The point I'm trying to get at is that for the last 30 or 40 years, Israel has tried to has bent to the will of they've followed the dictates of the United Nations and the United States and said, okay, we'll do this, we'll do that, we'll give them these concessions, we'll give them that concessions. On October 7th, with that massacre, all that changed. The first is that the considered opinion of most of the quote-unquote experts is that was the end of the Netanyahu administration, that Netanyahu was finished, that he had allowed this to happen. Secondly, this meant, of course, because we had allowed Iran to come to the very brink of developing nuclear weapons. We had not only allowed them, but we had paid them to do so for the last 20 years, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, of course, Israel could not retaliate against Iran, who was the one that was funding both Hamas and Hezbollah, because Iran was a near nuclear power, if not.
It's like the enemy within.
And Netanyahu said, "Nuts to y'all. I'm done. Everybody out of the sandbox." And he went in, despite the condemnation, but despite the condemnation by both the Biden administration and the United Nations. Despite the fact that can you believe this? The Biden administration held up military aid to Israel and continued to pump money into
It's evil.
the Hamas. And this whole fiction that, well, it's the poor people of Gaza. They're the ones that elected Hamas. Did you know there was an election 15 years ago or whenever it was?
80% of them voted in the leadership.
Hamas is in charge of Gaza because the Palestinians elected them.
There are no Palestinians, they're Arabs.
That's right. They elected them.
Amen.
In any event, Netanyahu said, I'm done with all of this. They went in, and they have now virtually wiped out Hamas. There's a small remnant, and they're proceeding with mop-up operations now. Then he turned he said, okay, check, that's taken care of. Next on the list. And he goes, and the 2,000 rockets that had come in from Hezbollah, and the experts considered Hezbollah to be the real military powerhouse. far more powerful than Hamas because they had, what was it, Jerry, 100,000 rockets or something like that?
Yep.
And they had, and Netanyahu said, well, tell you what, remember those pagers we sold these guys? Did you know that you heard about the pagers blowing up?
Yeah, that was classic.
That was, wasn't it?
So Hamas up in Lebanon,
That was a good one.
Hamas was concerned, rightfully, that the Israelis would be able to track their cell phones, triangulate from cell phone towers to find out where their positions were. And so they went to pagers, right? Beepers. And they had purchased pagers from a company, I think it was in Australia or someplace, wherever it was, some foreign country, had given them a screaming deal on pagers. What was it, Jerry, 5 years ago?
Screaming would be a good word.
Screaming. So 5 years ago, or whenever it was.
Yeah.
Well, it turned,
Israel set this company up well in advance,
The-
over a year in advance.
the company that Hamas, or Hezbollah bought
Blown up too.
was an Israeli company that they had disguised as being a Chinese or whatever it was company. And the pagers were manufactured in Israel and had, yes, they were pagers, but they had two other features. They had GPS positioning trackers in the pager,
Wow.
and they had high power.
Was it just by accident that it's like a good thing we put those in those pagers, or did they know?
Yeah,
I'm gonna guess no.
it was the same accidental deal where Daniel told the Magi what to look for. No, it was not by accident at all. They had this planned out. So they put plastic explosive in there as well. So, and that was years before. So these guys are running around
Thinking everything's cool.
thinking everything's cool. But meanwhile, Israeli intelligence is saying, oh, there's one of our pagers right there. We know that's their headquarters because 16 pagers just came to this same house, that kind of a deal. So they're tracking where they are. And Netanyahu then says, okay, we're done with Hamas. We're mopping that up. Time to go to Hezbollah. Trip the pagers.
That's right.
Boom! What,
555.
bend over and kiss it. Yeah, that's right.
Exactly.
I think it was 2000. Blew up, taking out, and it was not. They didn't give pagers to the foot soldiers in Hamas. They gave pagers to the leaders.
That's right.
So
Did you get Biden one?
I'm sorry. What's that?
Unfortunately not.
What was that,
I
sweetie?
said they didn't give one to Biden?
But Biden would have left it on his dresser anyways. He wouldn't have.
He wouldn't have remembered he had it.
That's right.
And they had engineered a feature so that in order to read the pager, you couldn't just do it. You had it took two hands. So if they're going to blow off your hands, they wanted to make sure they were both wrapped around the pager at the time. And for those of us who need cheaters, you had to hold it up close to your head too.
And the men that had them in their pockets are no longer men.
There,
Right.
So those pagers,
Never mind no 72 virgins, okay, because I'm running the game.
they got no use for you.
so those same pagers were not, in the Israels didn't share them amongst themselves to use those pagers? No, they were just
Turns
one
out,
purpose
right.
only
Yep.
to,
So then, after the pager incident, the Hezbollah went to, I think it was walkie-talkies. Well, guess who had supplied the walkie-talkies?
wow.
For real?
Wait for it.
For real.
I didn't get that one.
What did you say? Hello? Hello?
Think about these.
One ringy dingy?
Makes you wonder about ours, we're all dependent on these, it's like,
So then,
Is there a story behind this that,
yeah, I think it's in that book in front of you.
I think it's Jesus Christ of Nazareth.
That's exactly right. So then, Iran, understand that Iran has all these proxy fighters that are supposed to go out and do the shooting and the dying so the Iranians don't have to. And one of them is Hamas, that they've been funding with U.S. dollars because the Biden administration has lifted the embargo, and we have given them, I
Barry
think,
left $100 billion on the tarmac.
well, that was just
Cash.
the weapons.
Balance of cash.
It's,
So,
No, that was your 87,000.
oh, yeah, the cash you're talking about.
Yeah, I'm talking about the cash he left on, and his argument was, well, it was their money.
Pallet.
What?
Did you know about that? That we dropped off pallets of American currency
Cash.
on the runway?
That was the Obama.
That's right.
Yes.
Oh, bummer, right?
Barry.
So anyway, the three most prominent proxies for the Iranians were the Hamas, may they rest in peace. Well, I take that back. And Hezbollah, and they're in a world of hurt. And who's the third one? The Houthis,
The Houthis, yeah.
right? Those are all funded by Iran. Well, actually, they're funded by the United States through Iran, but okay. So Iran now thinks, oh, well, these guys are, we're going to stir up. The whole thing was Trump brokered a peace deal in the Middle East called the Abraham Accords, where he brought Egypt and Israel and Jordan and Saudi Arabia. He brought all these players together and brokered a peace deal. All of these guys, including Saudi Arabia are Sunni Muslims, and Iran are Shiite Muslims, and they hate each other, right? And so Iran was trying to break up this peace accord, and that's why they've got the Houthis bombing into Saudi Arabia, are sending missiles into Saudi Arabia and all that stuff. Anyway, so Iran says, well, we can't have this, so they launch in two different attacks about 200 missiles directly at or on top of Israel. So they have two different missile attacks, 200 missiles for each attack. The Iron Dome, you know, Star Wars that everybody laughed at Reagan about?
Yeah.
Well, it works. Very few of them got through. And the UN says, well, Israel, you can't react.
Israel says, what, bad?
So Israel is just last week or in the last week or two, they flew several attacks. The first thing they did is they annihilated all the Russian-built anti-aircraft radar systems. So Iran is now virtually and then they blasted their
Missile fabrication factories.
and their military. So Iran is now virtually defenseless.
back to where they were, square one.
So Netanyahu has defied conventional wisdom and said, no, we're not doing this anymore. We're not, the whole UN deal, you can do that, Biden, if that's what you want to do.
Yeah.
We're not doing that.
American deals.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not realistic.
Okay, so hopefully everybody
Yeah, that was it.
learned something. And once again, we will be back next Wednesday, 6 o'clock for fellowship meal, and our study commencing at 6:30. Is there anything that anybody wants to add at the end? Or?
No, that was good.
Okay, excellent.
What's excellent?
And you didn't remind me, but this time I am going to take my my glasses so when I get back to the console, I can actually see what
There you
I'm.
go. Sorry about that. My bad. Yeah, it will get more entertaining, I'm sure, in the next few months. I don't know how people that don't have God in our life deal with this kind of news. Because if I didn't and I was watching this unfold, I'd be just wringing my hands going, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? What am I going to do?